Hey, welcome everyone to the Agency Sessions. I'm Jason Fisher, and we decided to unveil our vision to Omaha with some of the best and brightest minds in the community, to be able to build a narrative around how we're going to build this content creator hub, one of the first of its kind here in Omaha. We've been cooking up this idea for years, and now it's time to involve you, the listeners. This podcast is your backstage pass to the journey. From the freshest voices to the classic minds, Agency unites us all. Join us from a what if to we will. These are the Agency Sessions, igniting your creativity and inspiring action. Buckle up.
I'm Todd Murphy. I'm with TrueScope. We're a media intelligence company, formerly with Universal Information Services. That company's been in Omaha since 1908. We track and monitor news throughout North America. We analyze the impact and the reach and the value of effort for public relations organizations. And I merged with a technology company in January, and now we're growing and becoming bigger and having a good time.
Good. Yeah, I know from when we originally met through the chamber, the Omaha chamber there, it was just mind-blowing to walk in on like something that I was just like, this exists.
Yeah.
I knew it existed. And, what I seen was just, and this is probably 10 years ago, maybe longer, that you kind of just had a whole setup of a bunch of different news feeds feeding into hard drives and digitizing things. And then it was the original algorithm before Facebook got to be as creepy as it was. And what you did was way less creepy because you're just going off TV.
Yeah. I mean, at its core, it's just recording all of the news, whether it was in print or TV and radio.
Right. Then
it got into the web and social media, but just capturing it to save it and then looking at it for our clients and analyzing it.
Sure.
But, at its core, I think what you're talking about is someone has all of this news. It's not just ephemeral and disappearing after, people watch the 5:30 network news and after it airs, it's gone in most people's mind.
Sure.
But we were archiving and saving it back into the 90s.
Okay.
And a lot of the more important things, like the Rodney King beating, the live footage of the early 90s, I saved that.
Okay.
And, moved it from VHS tape to DVD and then from DVD to digital cloud.
Did you save the VHSs as well?
Well, in a lot of cases I did.
Okay. And you got to have redundancy, right?
Yeah. And the problem is VHS tape degrades over time. The colors start to move around and the magnetic particles start to slide in there and become unaligned. And so I had a little bit of a hard time getting rid of the original, but once we have it digitized, I feel good that I might be able to get rid of the VHS tapes because they took up a lot of space.
Absolutely.
But the DVDs, a lot of those I've saved.
Yeah. I only ask because, going into kind of what you're sharing about those types of kind of elevations or kind of, generations of media is exactly, what we're kind of here for today. Not even kind of, we're here for that. As I think about that, there was the Marion Stokes project. Have you heard about Marion Stokes?
If I have, it's not top of mind today.
No, you're fine. You'll check it out later. So this woman, Marion Stokes, was the U in Philadelphia. But she was a private citizen.
Okay.
She was kind of like Ben Gray and you had a baby. Okay.
Okay.
So
not possible today, but possible in the future.
Sure. In the future. And so with that in mind, what she did, and the reason I said is because her obsession with her, because it wasn't a business, this was not a business model for her. So that's a big difference, is that she started back, I think, if I remember, you'll probably know it was it was the terrorist back probably in the 80s that took over a plane. It was like kind of the first real national.
Maybe like the Pan Am Lockerbie bombing or.
No, this is a flight.
Okay.
That they took over, but probably from like about the 80s to 2012.
Yeah, so she's one of the few people that we would, in my business, my dad, I heard him start using that phrase, and so I've plagiarized it from him. News junkies.
News junkies.
And they're not just, me or my dad, but or Marion Stokes. But there's a lot of people out there who are just news junkies. And then some of them take that obsession to the point of saving the articles, clipping articles, and they're not even doing it to monetize it. No. They're just saving it at home.
Because they know, just like a lot of people know, that it's going to come back and be relevant, right? Yep. And so she did 70,000 tapes. She ended up, from that time, she started hiring people to do recording for her.
Wow.
Rented 6 apartments, if I remember correctly, in New York. So, I mean, gosh, I don't know, but she funded it all. And then it ended up going to the Internet Archive or something of the sort, to where they digitized most of it or whatever else, but it helped with AI because they took all the transcription off the tapes when it was first happening on TV,
right,
and was able to start feeding that into kind of AI and everything else. So lots of, you'll have to check it out.
I'm amazed I don't know about it. I thought I knew everything about anyone who was archiving and
she was
tracking
a personal
news.
Yeah, she was a personal, just a private citizen. The documentary just came out, so it was kind of like, if you knew, you might have read it or you might have come across it, but I tell me later if you find out.
I'm going to track it down now.
Yeah, it blew my mind, but it made me think. So what I got interested in is, after Ben Gray had lost his last election, there was we were doing a little bit, and I probably should have called you then, but we were doing a little bit of research on Facebook of trying to pinpoint where this narrative came from, of like, Ben Gray did nothing with his life. Yes.
Well, I am a fan of Ben Gray. I used to see him at Brown Baggers getting lunch downtown, and I was one of the probably strange, pathetic kids who actually watched Kaleidoscope growing up. But
and that was, so the interesting thing is, and we were talking about this, is that if someone was 50 plus, maybe they watched it, because we were trying to think of, like, right, if I'm 18, and I was probably around 18 still when his show was still on in the 90s, 95, so I'm dating myself, but I thought, okay, let's find the age range of people who watch Kaleidoscope, because that was his big pivot into politics.
Well,
right?
I probably was at the low end, because my dad would get up and watch all those local news and public affairs programs, the long format, the 30 minutes. The Joe Jordan had one on KMTV about politics, and obviously Ben Gray was the long hauler.
Sure.
Even WWT had a program on and off for a while. But those long formats, generally on Sunday, my dad would be watching all those, and hell, there weren't any cartoons on.
No.
So I'm like, okay, I'll watch this.
Just soak it up.
And then so I'm probably 7, 8, 9 watching Kaleidoscope, and they're talking about, the tax levy, and, and I, at that time, don't even know what's going on, but my dad's watching it, so it must be important.
Sure. And then later on, it all clicks, right? And so that was kind of the aha moment for me, is that someone had to be, most people that watched that weren't like a news junkie or had a dad who was in the business.
Yeah.
It was kind of either you had to have a rare, as a kid, you had to have a rare interest, or a family member or someone else that was in the industry, right? And so, long and the short, what we realized is that it had to be about 50 plus, probably about 30 years old, as we imagined back in the 90s.
Right. For the end of it, to catch the end of it.
To actually be in his like heaviest watching age, audience age range, homeowners, people who are a little bit more concerned citizens. And then you did have a few people, I know a few people that, as I've kind of talked, I realized that were a few people like yourself in the Black community and such that were like, oh yeah, I was on there. I did the thing, or my mom or my uncle was on there.
I just remember the graphics changing over the years. You know, it was super funky when it started, and it got maybe safer and more. They had more consultants telling them, "Oh, you need these colors or that," graphic. But I remember his music and his graphics. It was, to me, I loved it all. I was like, this is on Sunday morning,
right? And when you talk about that, that's the culture, right? Because we're used to, this is the format for news, and this is the format for a cultural activist show and everything else. And a lot of names for Ben, where he was just kind of a really militant guy, is what I've known him as.
Yeah.
And it come to kind of just be, you know, kind of this person who still in that way, but realized that, okay, I got to approach this a little bit different than the iron fist every time.
Yeah.
So,
and that stuff like all went over my head because my parents were super cool. They were like, you know, middle of the road people, not right, not left, you know, listen to the person, see what they have to say. So I just thought he was talking about interesting topics. I didn't even know there was like this under narrative of him being a militant guy, or I'm just like, oh, he sounds intelligent. Sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He's done his research and
passionate, you know,
and I just dismissed it as like, yeah, he's a news guy.
There you go. And I mean, in many takes, he was a journalist. He is a journalist at heart.
In the classic sense of what journalism was, not today's. There's a lot of people in media that I don't classify as journalists.
Right. Absolutely. I couldn't disagree more. And with all of that, like kind of disconnection that's happening now, that's what happened with Ben.
Yeah.
We traced it down to a few different stories that were online, and the narrative got to be where at that time, just because what was happening in the country, there were a lot of angry Black folks that were like, okay, this George Floyd stuff, all this stuff has got to stop. Of course, we had presidential stuff that just made people unhappy. It was just a culmination of a bunch of things and COVID, of course. And to say the least, that the people that voted the most during that last election, the actual final election, was a younger audience. And it got to be where it's like, he's been in here long enough, he hasn't done anything. And that was the narrative that just ran off. No facts based, no anything else. And we know how that goes now.
Perception's reality.
Perception is reality. And I think it's always been that way, but more and more because it's such a action reaction type thing that, you know, before a book could get printed and it would take a long time for it to ever kind of really fulfill everything, or the news could even go around, but you'd have to have it in enough channels. And now a lot of the channels have, of course, merged, and they're just regurgitating a lot of the same things. We know how that goes under the umbrella.
But one point I want to make sure I get in there is I think there's less personal accountability to verify the credibility of where we're getting our information from. You know, journalists don't try to get the story wrong any more than a doctor hopes that their patient dies.
True journalism does not. You're
Professionals don't want to do a bad job.
No.
But we're doing a bad job as a society, as a civilization. We've abdicated the responsibility of checking the facts.
Right.
We're just going to accept that person did their job when they have an agenda.
And I agree, and I won't go too far down it, but I realize that part absolutely for journalism. But I have this theory, which will still feed into what we're talking about with agency, which we'll get to that in a minute, is that news ended up being, it got WWE-ified. Okay.
Yeah.
I just made that up, but my theory is people felt like news or the government or whatever the case may be was kind of just, they weren't really checking facts, or they didn't know what facts were really real. Infotainment is the perfect term.
Yeah.
I like that better than my WWEified. But they knew that it was wrong. Yeah. It's the hot takes in the comments of the social media and everything else where who can leave, and they know they don't even care anymore. Now it is infotainment.
Yeah, the clickbait. They're creating clickbait to amplify on their social media channels and drive people through to their website.
100%. So we're in a weird space right now, but there are a lot of us like yourself, me, younger generations who do have, you know, a heart of truth and want to know and want to like just be grounded in something to know that humanity, I think, is good. You know,
and that's a good summary of basically that's what our clients rely on my company to do for them. It's no longer just news monitoring; it's media intelligence. Can you tell us what does this mean? Where is the misinformation? Where is the disinformation? And I feel really lucky to be with TrueScope because they're building technology in that will help identify that. Nice. So it's a super cool time in kind of a strange, pathetic way for me. Not everyone is into it as deeply as I am, but now we have some technology that lets us go beyond just looking at news. And now we can see what is the origin, what is the facts, what's the credibility. So it's cool.
That's awesome. I'm excited to find out more about that. Because I know
we still do Free Beer Friday though, so come by any Friday at 3:30.
There you go. I know. So the realization for like how news and how information is moving hit me pretty heavy. And I talked to Ben, and Ben kind of got it, but you know, Ben is of an older generation to where he's like, basically he knew the what was it, the gossip game where you whisper in someone's ear. What is that? The whole telephone game.
Yeah.
The telephone game.
By the time it gets to the end, it's totally changed.
Totally changed. And he understood that. I kind of just translated it for him. And I just said, you know, Ben, no one knows who you are right now because of the generational part of it. It's not even anything to do with old. It's the media and the legacy hasn't been.
So do you feel like he's been erased in a way?
I don't know what to call it, but it raised a really big red flag for me because it wasn't just Ben. This wasn't articulated as Black culture or anything else, but I knew my interest in it is partially that, and that's what he was right there. He came to me with a box of tapes, and it wasn't directed at Ben. And how I found out it wasn't directed at Ben is because then he only got those tapes from KETV, Hearst.
Yeah.
They were kind enough to give him his whole tapes back.
Nice.
And they were just now in the process of digitizing their own tapes. So it wasn't directed at Ben. In 2023, and I have to say this again, in 2023, they are just now digitizing. So if you go out, and I'm sure your media library is obscene.
Yeah.
But
it's on the 29th floor of the Woodman Tower.
29th floor. Yeah, it's pretty dry up there. So you got some leverage there. If someone tries to find a Husker game right now, 95, right? Greatest time in Husker history. It's our favorite. Good luck finding that online or on a streaming service.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't exist. I
think I've got it on a DVD up in my storage, and there's some copyright issues around how you can use that stuff.
Sure.
But Tom Osborne had waited a while for his championship. So I figured, well, this is pretty momentous. And I just said, I don't know what I'm going to need it for in the future, but I'll keep it.
And that's, at the end of the day, this is where we're at. Like, if you can say like the most prized possession of Nebraska, the Huskers isn't digitized off a tape in its entirety, then we're in an interesting space and a place because it was the news. Like you said, you're one of the rare people that sure you have it digitized, but they don't have a Todd Murphy in every state and every town in every country.
No. And, I don't necessarily blame the stations because news the word itself is it's got to be breaking. It's got to be new, not history. Now, so they kept it all. They had the foresight not to dump it.
Sure.
But they never had the time. Like, how you say, when I have time, I'm going to clean out my garage.
None. It wasn't part of their, like you said, it wasn't part of their regimen. It wasn't part of their
protocol. No one to do it.
Yeah.
And so the stations have handled it differently. And the VP and GM, Jim McKernan over at WWT, he did a huge project at KWWL in Waterloo where they worked with the university and digitized everything.
There you go.
So there are some general managers, presidents, vice presidents of stations.
That were a little fortuitous.
Yeah, they're a little more forward thinking about let's preserve this.
So, to come up with an operation, or you called it a procedure, or what was it?
Protocol.
Protocol, right? Yeah, operations and protocols there. But, to have a protocol like that built into our community is big. If we think back on the history of what you and I know of what we can find, or just literally word of mouth on the jazz scene here, strange enough, not too much of a narrative, and then we'll get into agency, is I started my business in the basement of Leola's Records and Tapes.
Yeah, I wish I was still open.
Right? And I'll tell you, there was a transition when she was closing down, when Miss Leola was closing down, that their family, like my office was in the basement there, and it was a little tiny spot, but they had storage down there of records and records and records and records. And I cringed because I just knew that their family wasn't going to keep up with them. There were so many gospel albums down there from Omaha. Yeah. And I'm not an Omahaologist by any means, and not a music cinephile or anything else, but I just seen so many different records I was like, wow. The amount of gospel records from Omaha was probably just cases full of it. And
Omaha has such a rich history around almost every corner in every neighborhood.
Sure.
And things like that are unrecoverable.
Lost media, as they call it.
It's sad.
So the idea was, okay, Ben brought in these tapes. I said, fine, we're going to digitize these things. and Ben was like, okay, sure, we'll digitize them. What do we do with them? Put them on YouTube, do something, we'll figure it out. And we started just getting a lot of interest from Hearst and KETV and other people, and just saying, well, they could live on our site and we could do this and we could do these things. And I said, okay, but how do we keep the momentum going? How do we get our next generation of journalists?
Yeah.
How do we get them to care and realize that you are somebody?
Yeah.
And we know that you are. Lived experience is one thing, but again, showing and proving and, this media is something else. And so we just kind of came up with this thing, agency. And I don't know if you got a chance to look at the website or anything, but I'll walk you through it. It was just kind of like, if we had a bunch of podcast studios like the one that we're in, if we had like 4 to 6 of them, we had some small video studios, probably about the same size and everything else. And we just let kids, creators, content creators, every kid wants to be a social influencer.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh,
If we look at the numbers,
it used to be they wanted to be a basketball star or an astronaut. Now they want to be an influencer.
They want to be a basketball star, but they want to be a basketball star influencer.
Yeah.
And that's where it's at. So it's kind of the hyphenated part, right?
Yeah.
The triple threat there. And that's where we realized, okay, let's just have them have fun. Let's insert some of this and show them what, you did as far as digitization, or just show them the finished product and everything else. But let's be that at the heart of where it's at. And just kind of put some things around them to where they're wanting to learn, having fun and all that good stuff.
So you're connecting the physical, if I understand it correctly, to a younger generation, so they can continue to preserve our history and build our trajectory, the arc of humanity in Omaha, potentially.
Absolutely. The culture.
But so one question I have, and I often wonder about this, is how do you get the passion in them? I kind of was born into it.
Sure.
And now I take a great interest, whether it's Omaha, South Omaha, North Omaha, whatever.
Right.
I think our company is maybe the only address or the only organization that's subscribed to the Omaha Star since it started.
Sure.
Sure. Now you're probably not going to find anyone that goes back that far because, we're 115 years old.
Sure.
But how do you get the passion? Where
they have it every day on their phones.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, you can't turn it off. I mean, as you said, like if you go around a classroom, we looked at the numbers and it's like 8 years to 38 years old that everybody wants to be like that range wants to be an influencer, like in the 90 percentile.
If you can get them asking the question, where did you come from? That's what it seems to me is like, everyone does not everyone, a lot of people do the genealogy thing.
Sure.
Oh, well, I came from, 1658 in Northern Ireland and, I was born a McMurphy.
That's a fun project. I mean, there's so many things that we could go on and do a genealogy thing or something like that. And
let's just take tell
us your story, right?
Take the last 75 years.
Sure.
Where did you come from?
Right.
What was your grandfather like? What was your grandmother? What'd she do? Oh, she worked at a grocery store. What is she, do you have anything from that time?
Yeah.
People want it. I don't know.
That's where it's at.
I feel like people want to know where they came from.
And they do. And it's getting them, like you said, to ask where, what, why, all the basics, right? And I feel like if you let them have fun first and then you sneak in some of that, that's what agency is going to be at.
Okay.
We'll have a lot of those spaces and places again for them to learn video editing, learn how to use equipment, learn audio setup, all the things, because they're going to want to do it. They're like, okay, I've seen the podcast, how to do that. And we're like, hey, can you help me with this cord? Can you help me with these lights real quick? And then next thing you know.
I'm just connecting ideas here, but I'm on the board of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association.
Yep.
And
they were in that conversation.
And they have many programs that are providing scholarships and funding equipment to help generate the next generation of engineers.
There you go.
They can't hire, the stations can't get people to run a board, to, rack a camera or whatever.
I can tell you right now, that's where it's at, because I'll tell you what, I went into school for engineering. I was kind of a weird kid too, just in a sense of like, it was practical. Like I wanted to be a Marvel comic artist.
Right,
okay.
right.
But I didn't know any Marvel comic artists in my neighborhood. And the only artist that I think, back then arts wasn't nearly as big and mainstream. And I think all I knew was the Happy Little Tree guy. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to paint happy little trees and I don't want any Marvel guys. So I'll do engineering. My mom didn't even talk me out of it. So
I go a backup plan.
That was it. I was like backup plan. And I was the kid that was just like, okay with that,
Yeah.
So I didn't go to school for video. I didn't go to school for any of this stuff, but I always had the creative bone.
Yeah.
And that's from my family. It's in the DNA, but you
So
learn.
You taught yourself trial and error.
And you learn from other people. That's what it was. Is I would be around somebody and I would stumble across somebody and they would say, okay. And I'd make the investment on, a piece of equipment, and I'd run across the Dana Altman where I'm at now.
Yeah,
and,
how do I do this?
Yeah. And after a while, you kind of, that's just, there's an industry that's there and it pulls you in. And a lot of these kids, they don't even know where to even start. So if you're I believe osmosis in a sense, if you're around a bunch of people and you have like the guy who's running the soundboard here and you have his wife here and you got Weberized,
yes,
they're going to start asking questions.
Yeah.
I've had them do it. I've worked with too many kids. I know you've worked with some youth before, and we've done small video projects, and that's just how they learn, is they are hands-on.
Yeah, make it tangible.
That is the real thing. So that's the idea. But more than anything, it's the culture, right?
Yeah.
You get to archive some of it. They get to create new culture. They get to ask the right questions and learn why.
Yeah.
Even some of the stuff around, someone brought up as a younger kid, and we were doing a conversation around agency, and he says, what about all the bullying? And what about kind of all the stuff? Aren't the social influencers, aren't they the ones who start all this stuff? And I said, in some ways they can be.
Mm-hmm.
I said, but if you have a real life like meetup and I'm helping someone with a video project and I'm saying, hey, let me see how that video did on your TikTok. And I'm starting, now it's a community. Now all of a sudden, if they're doing something that's out of line or anything like that, there's a community around it, right?
Yeah.
So those are the types of things I think of real life experience, exposure, and that sort of thing. And so the goal is to get a building built, get all those things built around it. I can imagine, UNO or UNL, got the Carson School of Film, you got Metro. It's going to be a launch pad for all those things. I feel like it would be,
And there are
engineers.
projects there, like I know the Nebraska Broadcasters Association is sitting on the archive of all of WWT's old videotapes.
Yep.
And they're struggling to figure out how do we work on that, because it's cost prohibitive to pay someone to digitize all of it.
It's insane.
But if you could, make it a public-private partnership with a nonprofit and let the kids get some training, you're going to get a lot of that done just as an educational exercise.
Absolutely. I mean, and they stumble across it because I know you look into it enough. Where they'll find something, I seen one the other day, someone showed me on their TikTok, and they showed me something of Richard Pryor having an interview. And, he was a very forward thinking person on civil rights and everything. Mm-hmm. And they thought they're the ones that they discovered like the ancient pyramids, because they found this video and then they converted it over and got it on, their TikTok. And they were just like, people were blown away. It goes viral. So it's a popular,
go back even to, and he became unpopular in more recent years.
Sure.
But Bill Cosby and Fat Albert.
Yeah.
I grew up on Fat Albert, and the life lessons I learned from Fat Albert and his buddies playing at the junkyard.
Yep.
And I got to admit,
it
wasn't my culture.
Yeah. I mean, it is. But
I learned the lessons.
It's shared culture. You gotta say that.
And so when my kids got to be old enough to watch TV, I got the whole Fat Albert series on DVD, and
hey, you gotta raise them up, right?
Yeah, it's good viewing.
The interesting thing is that's the arc too of life. You live long enough, become the villain sometimes. And with one of the first people that Ben interviewed for the show was
Bill Cosby.
Bill Cosby.
Wow.
Yep.
Well, and another interesting thing about Ben is he was a photojournalist.
He was a photojournalist.
So he had to start by telling stories with images,
right? Framing,
right? The whole
military. That's where he was
how you frame something. Yeah. If I do a close up on you, but then I pan out and I see that you're in line for something,
sure,
it changes the whole story.
It does.
So he learned how to tell a story without words first, and then I think got to the easier part afterwards. So to me, he's a unicorn. He's very,
he is very, really one of those people that's,
I'm kind of a fanboy for him though. So,
and that's where we're at right now for a lot of our people.
Yeah.
It's just like, we don't even know who's in our own backyard. I did a project with the Urban League youth. It was a national Urban League. They called it cultural literacy. Not sure about the term, but they had the term called cultural literacy. We went out and we had the kids write all the questions. We set up all the fancy camera gear and lights and everything else. And then we had them do the interviews. And it was just one of the people was Dr. Marguerite Washington over at the Omaha Star.
Mm-hmm.
Another one was just an everyday person who was a blue collar worker who was in a retirement home behind the Urban League there. Another person was Miss T, who was at the Urban League at the front desk forever in civil rights and everything else. She passed away recently. So, those types of stories, they had those conversations, and they had 4 hours. Like, they did an hour with each one of those people. Yeah. We did all the editing and everything else. And then we interviewed them about their experience. And within that time, those kids were blown away from just everyday people's stories, except for everybody's got their superpower. They don't realize, like, everybody is interesting. Yeah. And so that just made me realize that this is really viable. Just even if you didn't know about agency, if you imagine now what you know, and there's a space and a place that has, again, you can kind of see the vision a little bit more. We'll fill it out later, but has cameras, has a place where they can just set their phone, flick on the lights, and have fun. And there's some things built around it to kind of help stir
methodology
imagination
and protocol, and keep them, have some bumpers on it.
Right. What do you imagine something like that would be?
Well, I think it's a great idea, and granted, I'm just one opinion, but
sure,
I think there's so much historical media asset. There's so many assets out there that you could probably you would have no shortage of people coming forward and saying, hey, we're the Durham Museum. We got this collection. It's not right for us to keep it, but we'd like to give it to your organization to train people and digitize it. It's a win-win-win. Anytime you can get a triple play out of it, that's huge. The broadcasters, the TV stations, the radio stations.
Didn't even think about that.
You may not have to even look for old media assets.
You got
once the word gets out about agency, and that's, it's Omaha. We can spread it like wildfire, instantly.
True.
You probably will have to get a warehouse.
Right.
Because everyone's like, okay, we've been storing this forever. Here you go.
Right.
Anything you can get off of it, great.
Yep.
Just keep us posted on how the project's going. And they might, and there's grants. Yeah. There's Library of Congress has grants periodically.
Sure. There's journalism grants.
There's journalism grants.
Yeah.
There's newspaper associations, broadcast associations. And some of the TV ownership groups have foundations as well.
Sure. So I'm, just saying that part, we know that part is anchored in, so now all of a sudden we realize the rich culture around that, Todd did something with his life, Ben did something with his life, and we got the facts to prove it here. We have some media around it to prove it, and we can start narratives around that. What type of impact do you think that has then?
I think it's huge, just from if you can index all of it. So if a person of any age, gender, color, whatever, wants to find a female who was running an animal shelter, who was the first one doing that?
Okay.
The ability to find the first of anything
and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so much of it now is easily done with voice to text.
Right.
You had closed captioning that came in. We've got closed captioning going back, I think, to 2002.
Oh, wow.
But so I think the ability to find, digitizing it's one thing. The second half is being able to find it. And then the ability for people to research, maybe it names names. I heard my aunt was involved with the CIA.
Sure.
How can I find anything about that? Was she ever, did Ben Gray?
Is this true?
Yeah. Was she ever interviewed about anything related to the State Department?
Sure.
I think there's 1,001 uses, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it'll have a profound impact on our community, on our kids, and helping them seek their truths and be truth seekers, right? And be a little bit more grounded than what it is now. And
once you know where you came from and who you are,
sure,
then you can share that with your kids, and their kids. And it could be that you're on the brink of starting a shift.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound too overly optimistic.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have lost their identity. I'm alone. I don't know where I came from. I don't know who I am. And when you don't know who you are, it's hard to go anywhere.
Yeah.
It's just hard. And life is already hard enough. We've made it very hard on ourselves. But giving someone an identity through their history, I think, is a cool project.
Couldn't have said it better. Like that just really put it into perspective. I appreciate you putting it like that. It's not that I didn't think about that, but it just really speaks a lot to legacy, and that's
we are
right?
the sum of our past.
Yeah.
Whether we like it or not. Not
Sure.
everything is good in the past.
No.
Omaha's got a plenty of history of things they did wrong.
Sure.
But it is part of us. It's
It
part of
is.
you. It's part of me.
And it shows growth.
Yeah.
That's the promising part. And I think when people can know the kind of, like you said, both sides of it, they can realize like, there's hope for humanity.
Yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
But we've gotten better. And we should continue to get better. At least that's the goal.
All right. Well, I couldn't say it any better. I appreciate you sharing your insight.
Thanks,
and
Jason, for having me.
all the things on this, because it was more than I ever expected. So I appreciate you.
Good. Glad to be here. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.